Welcome everyone to the final session of the day. I agree this session should be interesting as it's about what we're all trying to do ultimately with our web archives, which is serve researcher needs with our web archives. So this session includes 3 different projects that are on different points in the process, from active production using cloud storage and compute for crawling, processing, and hosting of data, to active work moving data into the cloud for large-scale research access, and finally, researchers directly interacting with extracted or derivative data sets from web archives that leverage hosted compute for data pipelines. So each of our presenters is going to give a summary of their projects, and then we will get into the Q&A. As you think about your questions, please add them to the Q&A so we can have them lined up. I'll introduce the speakers in the order that they will summarize their projects. So first up, we'll have Mark Phillips from University of North Texas Libraries, who is a PhD. He's the Associate Dean for Digital Libraries at the University of North Texas Libraries in Denton, Texas. And he will be summarizing the presentation, but he's also joined here for the questions with Dr. Sawood Alam, who is a web and data scientist of the Wayback machine at the Internet Archive. After their summary, we'll hear from Sebastian Nagel, who is a crawl engineer at the nonprofit Common Crawl. And then after that, we'll hear from Ben Lee, who's a PhD candidate at the Paul G. Allen School for Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington, who will be talking about his work with Trevor Owens from the Library of Congress. Okay, so we will hear first from Mark, whenever you're ready.
All right, can everyone hear me just fine?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So just to recap the work that we've been doing, this is from the end of term web archives. And the goal of the project was to provide a greater access to the 2008, 12, 16, and 20 end of term data sets that were captured. We are interested in focusing on the computational consumption of the collection, which currently is challenging because of the size, the access, the scope, and the storage issues associated with making these large data sets available. We were really interested in encouraging the reuse and research with these end-of-term data sets. And we wanted to also provide canonical data sets for each of the crawls so that we can reference things and write about them and talk about them in consistent ways. So to do that, we began working. The Internet Archive and UNT specifically took the lead on this project. We contacted Amazon and their open data platform projects and arranged with them to host a copy of the data sets on that platform in S3. We based all of our work off of the really wonderful work that is being done at Common Crawl to try to use their structures, some of their coding, their documentation to kind of build out what we were offering with WARC data, WAT, WET, CDX, and then also a column-based format, Parquet, an index for all the content. And so we're currently in the stage where we've moved the 2008, 2012 content to the cloud, and that's available from the eotarchive.org website. We're in the process of moving the 2020 data from the Internet Archive, and then we'll go back and work with the end of term 2016 data. After that, we'll start some additional metadata enhancements, including content-based format detection, content-based language detection, and incorporate that into those columnar indexes with Parquet. So happy to answer any questions that you all have about this process and the lessons that we've learned along the way.
Thanks, Mark. So, Sebastian, do you want to summarize your project?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, so fine. Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, my the project or the presentation is about Common Crawl, and we are since 10 years now hosted in the Amazon cloud, hosted as a public data set. We focus on data users. That means natural language processing, web science, internet security. And our users are software developers or data scientists, but not end users browsing the archives in a web browser. So that's very specific for our web data. And yeah, important is that the cloud is not just a hosting platform. It's also good to process the data. So actually more than 60% of the data usage happens in the AWS cloud or on AWS. And also we by ourselves use AWS for crawling and data processing. Other users, of course, may use different cloud providers or using their own data centers, for example, universities. So there's also downloads out from the cloud are happening. And yeah, what we actually do, or in order to support our users, we provide examples how to process the WARC files or secondary data formats. The examples include programming code and documentation, and are based on big data tools to allow to scale up. But it's important, it's only just examples, easily extensible, but no guarantees that a particular use case is covered or that they fit any requirements of the users. So basically, users are forced to write their own software, at least few lines of code. In turn, and that's actually what we want to stimulate, is users contribute back tutorials, examples, software, papers with code, often in a much better quality than we actually could provide. These materials. And in general, if you look at usage pattern, we see that Common Crawl users are most interested in textual content for natural language processing, and they prefer recent captures, smaller secondary data formats, or formats with a good tooling available. So that's the summary.
Cool. Thank you, Sebastian. If anyone has questions for any of our speakers, please add them to the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to them in just a second. So Ben, do you want to give your summary?
That's great. Thank you, Andrea, and it's great here to be a part of the session with Mark and Sawood and Sebastian. So for a little bit of context on the video that you may have watched, this work is in collaboration with Trevor Owens. I'll be talking on his behalf as well. But this is on work really trying to leverage some of the derivative data sets that the Library of Congress has produced with their web archives, in particular the 1000.gov PDF data set. And the research that we've been undertaking really tries to explore, one, how we can try to use some multimodal machine learning techniques to try to make sense of these PDFs, and also look toward visions of how we do this work at scale. And I'll mention here, really tying into the theme of this session, thinking about questions related to how do we do this computing, but also tying into cloud-based resources that, say, Mark and Sebastian are talking about, and also, and how we leverage cloud computing to make this research possible as well. In terms of the work itself with the 1000.gov PDF dataset, we're looking at basic questions surrounding how we improve searchability or access related to web archives or born digital content writ large. And in particular, trying to take a look at methods such as visual similarity search or visual analysis to be able to uncover trends that we might not be able to find through the kinds of metadata that are provided in the data dumps that we have available. But of course, I think the real or long-term vision of this work is trying to unify an approach involving the metadata we have, the kinds of different media types we have available, even document structure, to be really trying to think about new ways to explore the collections. I think making them available for researchers or subject matter experts, also from a curatorial standpoint, in terms of how we can re-envision how someone who inherits a large web archive can go about just trying to make sense of it and provide finding aids or materials for it. And then lastly, for the perspective of public usage and how it might be an opportunity for serendipitous search or a new way to engage. So I think I'll wrap up my little introduction there.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I see that we're starting to get some questions in the Q&A, which is great. I want to start off, though, with a question for all of you speakers. So knowing what you know now about the requirements for computational access of web archives, is there any advice you could give institutions who would like to make their web archives accessible in a similar way? Are there things that you have learned along the way that you would have done differently? We can start with any of you if you have something to share.
Okay, let's start, if it's okay.
Sure.
So yeah, my answer, of course, under the assumption that users access the data directly, so there is no service layer between data and user. So I mean that's the case for Common Crawl and maybe also for end of term archive, and so that's important. So I mean there are basically two things we struggle with. One is that the popular tools users prefer or use change quickly. So I mean, just few years ago, it was Hadoop, later Spark as a big data processing tool. And now users tend to use cloud-hosted Jupyter notebooks or in general serverless computing. So that was a paradigm shift. And of course, we should adapt our tutorials, everything, examples and so. And also expectations may change or grow generally. So currently users demand to be able to process billions of page captures per hour. That's quite amazing and then crazy on the other side. And yeah, the other side is of course that you have users which are stick to the set of tools they are familiar with, and yeah, just are upset if their tool chain is broken for some reason. I mean, one reason could be that you have to change somehow the data layout. So it's very hard to design your data layout in advance so that it can stay for tens of years, or at least for a large period of time. So you don't have to change anything. And yeah, in general, it's difficult to find a good balance between maintenance of existing tools and adapting to new technologies. And yeah, at least my experience is often it saves a lot of development to retire older tools and switch to new technology, and ideally use cloud services, which makes life a lot easier.
So a lot to balance there.
Yeah.
Okay, how about one of the other presenters?
Sure. To follow up, I think that we're still kind of very much in the early stages of finding out what all this really means at the end. But you know, I think if we didn't have something to kind of base our structures, like Sebastian was mentioning, you know, the structures we wanted to lay things out, how we wanted to think about providing access, I think we would have gotten in, and so we based all of our work on the Common Crawl, just because we could, you know, reuse tools, reuse documentation, hopefully get, you know, maybe interest some of the researchers that are using those tool sets or that data set to move over to the end of term and maybe rework some of their analysis. And so for us, it was helpful to just build on the work that was already there instead of kind of coming up with a new structure, coming up with a new process that in the end probably wasn't going to be that interesting or different. But then we would have to build everything from the ground up. And I think the thing that Sebastian mentioned first is to try to remove that barrier of kind of providing access to the data was something that we really wanted to. And even Sawood and I struggle with that. Like all of this data is captured in our repositories, but like getting that out in any sort of reasonable, you know, amount of time, you know, it's all kind of dispersed through our preservation repositories, and like it's there for the web archive, but like getting it into a place that you can push it somewhere else is involved. And we've kind of things that we thought would be pretty straightforward. It's not technically hard, it's just a lot of waiting and just a lot of juggling things around, storage spaces, locations. And it's once we get it into the cloud, it suddenly becomes really easy to do things systematically, programmatically, and at scale.
So I would add to that the lessons learned. I mean, Mark and I argue every single week. We have weekly meetings and we talk about things. And I mean, in that process, things improve, obviously. A few things that I noted is if you want to share the data with broader public, try not to dedupe. In a dry run, when we were running 2020, crawl, we had the revisit record in there because YouTube was on. Now the problem is you captured a web page, but you have already captured the same page somewhere else in another collection, and those WARC files are not going to be public. So the sub collection that you are going to make public, that will have references that cannot be rehydrated by the end users, and that basically renders useless in some cases. So we noticed that problem early enough that we shut the crawlers down and we restarted with those configurations changed. Some other things that we learned is later in the process, please add as much metadata and whereabouts as possible, because Mark and I were struggling with trying to find the scope, like will this file be part of this collection or not, or are we missing something? That was especially problematic for early years of captures. The 2021, I ran that crawl, so I knew a lot about that. But well, at the same time, I think I'm failing to document some of the understanding that is in my mind, and I did not provide that piece of information in those collections yet. I should be doing that so that someone who comes after me and takes care of these collections, they know it better.
Yeah, that came out in your presentation too, that it was hard to find the boundary between these collections. Ben, any thoughts from you?
Sorry, I'm finding the mute button. Yeah, I mean, I would think I would just mainly second what everybody else has said. I think coming from the perspective of a researcher as opposed to somebody who's on the more infrastructural side, it's just I'm more of a listener or a learner in this case. But so I'll go ahead and send it back to you, Andrea.
Okay, sure. We have a question from Nicholas Taylor, and it's directed to the end of term project, but if other of you have thoughts about this, you can answer as well. So you mentioned that the AWS folks approved your request for data hosting in the public datasets program pretty readily. What could you infer were their main considerations for doing so? Do you suppose that the web archiving community could and should be making greater use of the AWS public datasets program beyond the relatively less legally encumbered end of term collections?
So from my point of view, in talking with the folks at AWS, they were really concerned with the openness of the data, with the idea that it could be made broadly available, and that within theory it wasn't encumbered by a lot of copyrights, and as we all know, that it's challenging in web archives in general. So when we were talking about the US federal government websites, and so that kind of ticked that box really well. It made it fine. The other things that they were really interested in is they wanted to make sure that we weren't just loading a bunch of content that's only useful in binary formats for our community that others couldn't readily come in and figure out how to use. And so for us, at least we had some talking points to talk about how things were going to be laid out and the formats, because we were from the beginning going to try to lean heavily on the Common Crawl. But once I started to mention the Parquet formats and how they would associate with some of their offerings and just kind of other big data tooling, suddenly it kind of, we said, there was a lot more interest in our data sets. And I think that, AWS is interested in the open data. I think they're also interested in, pushing not necessarily their tools, but that type of tool and that type of data format that can be used in these large scale compute clusters and compute nodes. And so if your data can align better with that, it's more interesting to them. And also, there's also just does the data lend itself well to be stored in S3? And ours does really well. And there's actually some really great side effects you get when we were able to, start up a Wayback or a PyDB instance directly off of the AWS. It was like magic for us, just because it just worked with kind of the way that we work in the web archiving space. It worked in that space, and it just worked really well. So the more that we can align our formats and our exports and our derived data sets with tools that are common and understood by broad users, I think the better. And I do think that there's a lot of opportunities for the whether or not it's the specifically the open data program, but I think kind of the process and the methodology that's being used just to have a consistent layouts of data, providing inroads, both documentation and then simple tools and complex tools to interact with that data makes it really useful.
Yeah, it sounds like having common tools and formats and processes to create them seems to be a common theme here. And Ben, I know you get into that a lot with your pipeline work. Is there anything there that could be shared in our community, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I'd first speak to, I think the work that Mark's been doing, and also of course, Sebastian at Common Crawl and everything, and saying that the different sort of multi-layered access points, I think, are incredibly useful for researchers based on, how fast they want data, what the specifics are in terms of what they're looking to leverage. So, I think building off of their work is the biggest benefit for sure in doing research in this space. And in general too, having access to like S3 like structure and stuff is really useful. I think it's just so ubiquitous across the sort of machine learning community at this point that it's really nice. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the sort of work or analysis that Trevor and I have been working on, definitely, I'd be, of course, always open to talking with people, and we will hope to make some code available here at some point or another. Definitely, I think, shared sort of pipeline infrastructure around, just getting stuff into basic featurizations around machine learning and stuff like that is really valuable. There's definitely been, quite a bit of community sharing around common crawl derivatives and things like that and machine learning in general. But I think making that extensible to, say, Mark's, end of term data and stuff like that too, I think can really help to open the collections and make them, or, make a shared community of data tools, and also just featurizations and stuff could be really valuable.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's a suggestion in the chat that an Iipc workshop on creating wets/wats and familiarity with Parquet format, for those who don't know, it could be interesting. So something for you all to think about, possible workshop, hands-on for everyone. So I have another question for all of you, but I'd like to encourage people, if you have a question for our speakers, it could just be about one of the projects you're interested in, or it could be something for all of our presenters to answer. Just please add it to the Q&A. So question for all of you: what do you think is needed for a good support service for researchers doing computational research on web archives? What are some of the key elements that would make it better for researchers, a better experience to use the web archives?
I think more examples, like handy examples that people can relate to, more outreach. And I mean, sometimes these formats that we talk about, I think Megan actually raised an interesting proposal there. Not many people are familiar with these formats, even in the web archiving community. I remember a few years ago, I was presenting to one of the other conferences where it was about web bundling, and I was the only one talking about web archiving, and a lot of people, they got so excited, and there was so much conversation around web archiving that the organizers of the talk, they tried to drift the talk away because this was not their focus. So, and the reason was not many people knew about it before. Like, so this whole kind of space is not very well known in some of the other communities. So outreach in some other conferences and taking this message there will be one way to kind of engage with other people.
Also happy to jump in. I think one continued challenge for researchers, and this isn't fully a problem specific to web archives, but I think certainly emerges from the questions of scale that come with computing against it, is just access to shared computing resources. I think doing this kind of research, oftentimes there are challenges about how you actually access this if you're not affiliated. If you don't have some sort of massive computing credits or affiliated with a large company or university that has access to a computing cluster. And I think about that a lot. I think especially when it comes to making research or research democratized, especially in the context of web archives, where, as I said, I think scale is really crucial. So I think thinking through some of those challenges as a community would be really valuable.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too at the end of term presentation about that AWS is funding the storage, but not necessarily the compute at the moment. Is that true?
That's right. Yeah, at this point, the AWS is handling the storage bill, and then at least currently, all of the compute is happening on servers at UNT. And so either it's coming from our repository, we're computing and then going into the cloud, or it's coming from the Internet Archive into the cloud, and we're pulling it down into a local Hadoop cluster that we built for this to do that derivative creation and move back in the cloud. And the reason that we're not doing it in the cloud is for stupid bureaucratic reasons of getting contracts with AWS for blah, 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 blah. It's dumb. But yeah, it's I think we're so early in this. I can only imagine things that I think will be helpful for researchers, as opposed to seeing how much is being done with the common crawl set, not only how much it gets used and just so many references to it, and you read an article and it's we use the common crawl set. You just hear in almost all the big papers that use big data like that. But then just the active channels for kind of communicating with both the message boards through Google Groups, and then also just code contributions and questions, and it's kind of mind-boggling, especially, and I know that Sawood and I was when we started, it's just where do we even start on this? And for us, it was once again the desire to kind of leverage that infrastructure, both people and technology, that already existed, so that we didn't have to try to stand this all up on our own. Otherwise, we probably just wouldn't have done it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear from you, Sebastian, since you are getting such a big uptake. So what should we all be focusing on if we want to put together a support service for researchers?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I think for Common Crawl, it's just self-driven now. So if you have researchers working with the data, others read their papers, and they get interested in the data. Wow, they did this, so why couldn't we do this? And so it's self-driven. We don't have to do anything except providing newer data. I mean, there's demand, of course, for more data or new data, and maybe also for new data formats, updated examples, a lot of maintenance, of course, but it's just running. And of course, if you are not at this stage, or I mean, you have to start with some examples, as Sawood said. I mean, you have to write the first seed examples by yourself and advertise them and to get it running.
Okay, that sounds like a good first step for people.
Yeah. I mean, just write an example tutorial which is easy, which has some, of course, attract some interest because it's interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I will mention, and this also relates to a previous question that I think Nicholas asked. So one of the things that I think is also an expectation from this free hosting through AWS is it's not only that we get to put the data up there, but there's the expectation that the end of term project will create documentation, will talk about this, we will make tutorials available. There's that expectation with that hosting, and so that is part of this whole process that I think is important, and something that we still have in front of us to do is to really make sure that we're creating a good atmosphere for folks like AWS to host web archive content, so that it doesn't just seem like it's this crazy blobs of content that nobody uses. So that's still for us to do, kind of moving out from here, but we have some ideas on our end about approaches we want to take, just because of the challenges we have with just resourcing people to help with questions and help with code and whatnot, and to do these first tutorials and whatnot.
Yeah.
I also think providing like high-level summary in many different ways will also motivate people when they land to that page or a site where we advertise this data. Like just saying it is an archive of end of term may not excite people enough, but when they get to see some network diagrams, some highlights, some counts and stuff like that, which might lead to, hey, let's look deeper into it and see what we find, right? So we'll get there. I will add one thing, this whole thing, like, I mean, that perhaps also kind of ties why these three talks were put together. So a lot of code and examples and documentation from Common Call is open source. And some of those tools kind of, build on top of the prior work in the IIPC community or from the Internet Archive. We are building on top of that, and we sure will make all that code and examples available publicly so that others can benefit from it. And at some point, we'll basically invite everyone in the IIPC to participate and make the ecosystem better, like documenting, answering questions if we get something from researchers.
Yeah, the researcher working group is probably a good forum for that within IIPC.